Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today, it's Friday, so we're going to be continuing with our Napoleonic-era series by Epic History. We're going to take a slight detour today to take a look at Admiral Nelson and his expedition to the Nile. We talked about it a little bit in the previous part 1 of Napoleon in Egypt. They did discuss Nelson tried to catch the French, but he ended up accidentally passing them in the fog and getting there first, and thought he had missed them, so he kept looking around. Well, we're going to get a little more detail on things from Nelson's point of view. Excuse me. So, as always, I will include a link to the original content in the description down below. I hope you guys will head over to Epic History and let them know that you are really appreciating this series if you like what you see here. Alright, with all that said, let's just get into this and see how it goes.
An Epic History Drachenfels collaboration. In 1792, the French Revolution sparked a European conflict that would last a generation. A struggle for mastery of...
That's about right. What, 1792 to what, around 1812-ish? Yeah, that's pretty much an entire generation tied up in this.
Europe and the world. A contest fought on land and sea. In this war of shifting alliances, the most enduring rivalry was between France and Britain.
Which, as it had been for a very long time.
Britain could not challenge France on land, but at sea, it was a different matter.
Oh yeah.
Britain's Royal Navy was as dominant on the waves as Napoleon was to prove on land. And in an age when Britain had many skilled naval commanders, one stood out above the rest. Horatio Nelson. Bold, inspiring and brilliant. For the British, he'd become a national hero and legend. These are the stories of his greatest battles.
Alright, 1798. Duty is the great business of a sea officer. All private considerations must give way to it. Captain Horatio Nelson, 1786.
1798. The 6th year of the French Revolutionary Wars. And France is winning. General Bonaparte's brilliant victories in Italy have forced Austria to sue for peace. Spain, once France's enemy, is now an ally. Britain is the only major power still at war with the French Republic.
The only major power. There's still a few other states that are at war with France, but Britain's the only great power. Still fighting the good fight. Excuse me, my voice is scratchy
British
today.
naval power makes a cross-channel invasion impossible. So the French government decides to strike at Britain indirectly by sending an expedition, led by General Bonaparte, to conquer Egypt. If the French succeed and destroy British influence and trade in the region, they will strike a powerful blow against their last major enemy.
Yeah, and we talked about that a bit last time, but the directory was very clear. Their official reason for doing this was to interfere with British trade and to secure better control of Mediterranean in general. But remember, the Suez is down here. If you control Egypt, you pretty much have a control of the Suez. That's really going to make life hard for England or Great Britain because they've got so many, so much of their imperial wealth, if you will, is tied up in places like India. And losing control of Egypt and potentially losing control of the Suez is a huge deal for England at the time. It cuts them off from one of their most productive, well, not one of, the most productive colony. Excuse me. Not sure why my voice is going out. I was doing fine all day until I started this.
The previous year, the British defeated a Spanish fleet at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent.
Yep.
But the Royal Navy currently has no major forces in the Mediterranean. Therefore, the French believe they can sail to Egypt in relative safety. When the British learn that a large French fleet is assembling at Toulon, They send Rear Admiral Nelson with 3 ships of the line to investigate. But he is driven south by gales, just as the French, with 13 ships of the line, several frigates and hundreds of transports, set sail. Bonaparte has given the British the slip.
It is an old saying, the devil's children had the devil's luck. I cannot find, or at this moment learn, where the French fleet are gone to. Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson, in Sicily, 19th of July, 1798.
Nelson is reinforced with 11 ships of the line, and learning that the French have stopped at and captured Malta, he correctly deduces that Egypt is their destination. He sets
Makes
off
sense.
at full speed
Really does.
to intercept.
Now, they don't mention it here. Maybe it had to do with that gale they did mention earlier. But if I remember correctly, Nelson lost some of his fleet was scattered during this event, especially his frigates, which were typically used for scouting. And it wouldn't be until right before he engages the French fleet, which isn't quite yet, that he regathers some of those lost ships, especially the frigates. So I'm not exactly sure where that happened in the timeline, but somewhere between where he talked about the gale and when the British actually find the French, Nelson did lose some of his ships and spent some time looking for them.
The British warships are much faster than the French invasion force, but they overtake their quarry on a foggy night, and though the 2 fleets pass within a few miles of each other, neither side spots the other. Unaware of their near miss, the British race on to Egypt. Arriving at Alexandria, Nelson sees no sign of the French and heads north to continue the hunt. He misses Bonaparte's fleet by 24 hours. The French land safely in Egypt and march inland, en route to a famous victory at the Battle of the Pyramids. The French fleet remains at anchor in Aboukir Bay. More than a month later,
They parked the fleet there because Napoleon and the guy he has in charge of the fleet can't agree on where to park it. Napoleon wants it in a place that will help protect his supply lines. And I can't remember the name of the other guy. Wanted it in a more defensible position. They end up compromising and putting it where they put it, which turned out to be quite the disaster.
word finally reaches Nelson in Sicily that the French fleet is in Egypt. Racing back to Alexandria with his squadron, he arrives on the 1st of August. He quickly locates the French fleet and prepares to attack. The French fleet is commanded by Admiral François-Paul Brueys d'Aguillet. He is an
I'm glad he is pronouncing these French names because even though I took one semester of French, I cannot do it.
experienced commander who saw action at the Battle of the Chesapeake during the American Revolution.
Right.
He's now a rare thing in the Navy of the French Republic, a 45-year-old aristocrat who's neither fled abroad nor been guillotined. Recently promoted to Vice Admiral, he has a reputation for personal courage mixed with strategic caution.
So brave but cautious. My kind of guy.
Admiral Brueys has one objective: to preserve his fleet.
Yeah, Brueys, that's the guy I was thinking of, yeah. He and Napoleon can't agree on where to put the fleet, so they end up compromising it and putting it where neither one of them wanted it. And that turned out to be a bad spot to put it.
Bonaparte's army relies on his ships for communications and supplies from France. What's more, when Nelson arrives, almost a third of his crews are ashore, foraging for water and supplies. Admiral...
Again, I think that's probably just an estimate. I seem to recall reading something about they didn't actually, there's no actual record of how many were ashore other than quite a few. So I think a third is a kind of a shorthand. I'd have to dig, but I'm not, but what I recall which isn't very much because I didn't spend a lot of time on the Napoleonic stuff. It didn't give numbers. It was just generic, a significant amount, around a third. But no actual numbers, as far as I know, are documented.
Brueys concludes he must fight a defensive battle. His fleet, 13 ships of the line and 4 frigates, will remain anchored in Aboukir Bay, in line and just under a mile from shore. His own flagship, the first-rate 120-gun L'Orient, is in the centre. Shoals and shallow water protect their western flank, meaning the French, with their reduced crews, only have to man the guns on one side.
Not quite accurate. That was the theory, but they had put themselves just a little too far out, so it was actually possible to come in on the other side as well. It was tricky, it was narrow maneuvering, but it could be done. They were just a little too far away. But the idea, yes, that was the plan, was to be so close to the shoals that you don't have to worry about attacks from one side.
Brueys issues orders for each French ship to secure itself to its neighbours, fore and aft, with heavy cables. The fleet is to form an unbreakable wall of ships, ready to resist any attack. Brueys well knows the reputation of his enemy, Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson. The previous year, Nelson had been feted for his heroic role at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, but 5 months later, he'd lost his right arm following a failed attack on the Spanish at Tenerife. He'd spent the rest of the year convalescing ashore, and therefore missed the British victory over the Dutch at Camperdown that October, something he found so frustrating, he declared he'd happily have given his other arm for the chance to take part.
That's a little extreme.
Having found the enemy fleet, Nelson is determined to engage and destroy it. And he has sound strategic reasons for a high-risk attack on the French. If Nelson can destroy their fleet, the French army in Egypt will be stranded, far from home, amid a hostile climate and population. It will mean the failure of Bonaparte's expedition, without a single redcoat stepping ashore. Nelson has 13 third-rate ships of the line, plus the 50-gun Leander, and a small sloop for running messages. Facing 13 French ships of the line and 4 frigates, the two forces are evenly matched, though the French flagship L'Orient, with 120 guns, is far and away the most powerful warship present. Nelson decides on a night attack that will exploit Brueys' caution. He will advance along the seaward side of the French line, and when his vanguard reaches the French flagship, L'Orient, his ships will drop anchor. His entire fleet will take on half the French fleet, with northerly winds preventing the remaining French ships from joining the battle. Nelson's plan is bold and simple.
I just don't know how much I'd like to rely on the winds. Wind can be a very fickle thing. I'm not sure in this particular region, and maybe that's why I'm not much of a naval guy in terms of tactics and strategy. I'm not much of a tactics and strategy guy anyway. Naval battles at this time in the age of sail relied heavily on ocean current and especially the wind. And the wind can be very fickle. So any plan you take can really easily go awry because of that.
But it will not go as intended.
Before this time tomorrow, I shall have gained a peerage or Westminster Abbey. Nelson to his ship's officers, shortly before battle, 1st of August, 1798.
The British fleet begins its final approach at 6 p.m. Under full sail, in line astern, the 74-gun HMS Goliath is in the lead. She is followed by HMS Zealous and HMS Audacious. The wind is from the northwest. The seas calm. The British do not have reliable maps of the bay, meaning there is a real risk of running aground. So HMS Goliath has to take careful soundings as she goes, checking the sea's depth. When Goliath rounds the entrance to Aboukir Bay, marked by shoals and a small island, the British begin their turn south to sail with the wind towards the French line. The French have been observing the British approach. and at 6:20 p.m, as Goliath comes within range, they open fire. Nelson has always encouraged his officers to use their initiative. So when Captain Foley, commanding HMS Goliath, sees there is a gap between the French ships and the shoals, he makes a snap decision to sail down it. Goliath's course will be followed by Zealous, Audacious, Orion, and Theseus.
All right.
Nelson's flagship, HMS Vanguard, will now lead the rest of the fleet down the seaward side of the French line.
This will be interesting.
Captain Foley's...
I knew that happened because I could remember one of my classes, them discussing that, how they had, the French had underestimated how much of a gap they had there. Or, yeah, underestimated.
His bold decision exploits a disastrous oversight by Admiral Brueys. He has assumed that the shoals make it impossible for him to be attacked from the landward side. Now, not only will his vanguard be doubled, attacked on both sides, but French guns on the landward side are not even ready for action.
Oops.
There are barely enough sailors to man them. As Goliath passes across the bow of Guerrier, she fires a raking broadside into her, round shot smashing its way down the length of the ship. Each following British ship blasts Guerrier in the same merciless manner. HMS Orion takes a wider track to avoid the melee developing at the head of the French line. This will bring her past the French frigate Sérieuse in the shallows. According to convention, ships of the line did not normally fire on frigates during fleet actions.
Right.
But when the captain of Sérieuse fires on Orion, he waives this protection.
Yes, he does. Yeah, that
Orion
only applies if you don't shoot first.
Holds her fire until she passes the French frigate, then returns fire at point-blank range. Her heavy broadside smashes the French frigate to pieces.
Bad idea,
The British
whoever
landward
ordered
column
that.
now drops anchor to take on the French vanguard, while the seaward column, led by Nelson aboard HMS Vanguard, arrives to hit the French from the other side. Each ship's captain singles out a target and drops anchor alongside. Vanguard alongside Spartiate, Minotaur against Aquilon, Defense against Purple Souverain. 5 French ships are now under attack from 8 British ships, most of them from both sides. HMS Bellerophon and Majestic now join the battle.
A lot of Greek names. You guys must have really loved their Iliad and Odyssey, and Greek mythology in general.
They head for the center of the French line. Bellerophon aims for Franklin, but overshoots and comes alongside Admiral Brueys' formidable flagship, L'Orient. HMS Majestic also misjudges her approach, becoming entangled with Tonon and fighting 2 French ships simultaneously. By 7 p.m, the light is fading. 2 miles north, the last British ship, HMS Culloden, cannot make out the edge of the shoals and runs aground.
Yep.
HMS Leander and the sloop Mutine divert to try to tow Culloden clear, but it will prove a futile task.
Now, to my understanding, and I don't know if they'll get into this since I've never seen it before, the Culloden does get trapped, but it's not really out of the fight. It is used as a staging area and a place to keep prisoners and or the wounded. So they still make use of it. It's just not able to join the actual battle.
Culloden's fate shows just how small the room for error has been during the British approach. The French vanguard has now been...
I don't know if he can get into this, so I'm going to touch it really quickly, and just in case he doesn't. And if he does, then oh well, sorry. But this would have been the perfect time to mention it if he was going to, that's why I'm going to do it now. One of the other few things I remember from my classes on this particular period, we had one of the guys in my class was kind of big into well, several of them were big on Napoleon, but one of them actually did a report on the Battle of Egypt, or fighting in Egypt, and specifically this naval battle. And we all had to present our writing to each other as part of the class. So I did learn a little bit about this. Maps of this region were scarce and not very accurate. So, while Nelson is doing all this maneuvering, he's also got his men doing a lot of sounding. If you're not familiar with what sounding is, it's basically measuring the depth, making sure that you're not going to run aground like that one ship actually did do. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because at this time, not quite at this time, but very soon after this time, there's going to be some major changes starting in how that's done. So, here in 1798, primarily it would be done with a sounding line or a lead line. It'd be a long, thin line with usually with a lead, what was it called? Not a plumb bob or a plummet, I think. Might be what it was called. Something close to that. It was typically just called the lead, but I think the technical name, I think, was plummet. And you would drop the line overboard, you'd let it fall until it hit the bottom of the sea, and then you could use that to measure how deep it was. In older days, that was often done by just noting where it's wet, pulling it back up and measuring it by arm length. Later, it would be measured typically by tying various types of their leather to specific intervals, typically 2, 3, 5, 7, and then 10. Intervals of 2s and 3s, typically all the way up. And what they would do then is, that would be how you measure it. You just look and see which of the tied-on markers was visible, and that would tell you how deep it was. And typically they'd call out, like, that Mark Twain, Mark II, that's where Mark Twain actually gets his name from. Or you could say, I think it was deep. If it wasn't right next to one of those markers, but between it, for example, you go from 5 to 7. So if it was between it, you might say by deep 6, meaning it's somewhere right in between 5 and 7. But you would say mark if it was right next to one of those knots. They had a whole system of this, and each of those knots would be a little bit different so that at night you could just feel which knot was the dry one and which one was the wet one, and tell by just the feel of it which knot you were dealing with, so you could still tell what the depth was. Really elaborate system. But it starts changing right around this time, right after this. They start getting mechanical leads and do mechanical sounding. And one of the earliest, and I don't remember the name of the inventor, I wish I did, but one of the very earliest actually had a system in the weight where as it went down, it would turn a crank, basically, as it descended, and that would tally up a depth. So you drop it, that crank would turn and just turn some counters so that when you pulled it back up, you could just look at it and read it, and it'd say the depth. So they came up with some new stuff. I want to say like right around 1800, 1802, really right after this. One last thing before we go on, because those of you who watch me a while know I like trivia. When we're talking about sounding, that has nothing to do with sound like in noise you hear. That actually comes from the Old English sund, and it's related to water or swimming is what it literally meant. It's an Old English word for swimming or water, and that's why it's closer related to something like a sound as a small bay of water that's connected typically to the ocean. For example, Puget Sound or Roanoke Sound. Thinking of sounds here in the United States, Vineyard Sound over by Martha's Vineyard, things like that. United States has a lot of sound, but most countries have at least a few, at least if they're on the ocean. So that's where that comes from. Just an interesting bit of trivia. Anyway, I'm rambling again, so let's continue.
Under heavy attack for 30 minutes. Conquerant has been completely dismasted. Her captain is dying. A third of her crew are casualties. She is first to strike her colours. But it's not all one-way traffic. HMS Bellerophon is heavily outgunned in her contest with Lorient.
Oh yeah.
200 men, a third of her crew, have been killed or wounded, and she's lost her main and mizzen masts. Her captain gives the order to cut the anchor cable, so the ship will drift out of the firing line.
Good call.
Around 8:30, two British stragglers, HMS Swiftshore and Alexander, join the battle late. In the smoke and gloom, they pass the drifting hulk of Bellerophon and nearly fire on her by mistake. Swiftshore and Alexander break the enemy line either side of Lorient, pouring raking fire into the French flagship. Aboard Vanguard, Nelson's been hit in the forehead by a splinter. His face streaming blood. He thinks it's the end. "I am killed," he announces. "Remember me to my wife." But he's soon...
Scalp wounds are nasty. Trust me, I know. A good 30 years ago, plus or minus, I had a piece of lumber fall from very high up on a shelf and just grazed the top of my head along this way. I got a reverse mohawk, tore off all my hair and a good chunk of my scalp here. But I had a hat on. I didn't realize how bad it was at first. I knew I felt it go by, and I ended up going over, sitting down, and a friend of mine saw that I didn't look good, and he said, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine. I just had a near miss with a piece of lumber nearly taking my head off." Like, "Are you sure you're okay? You're looking awful pale." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine." Right then, I put my hand up here and wiped it. As soon as I lifted that hat up, blood started pouring down. I'm like, okay, maybe I'm not fine. Yeah, I had a reverse mohawk. It wasn't pretty, trust me. And yeah, it bled and it bled. It was horrifying when I lifted that hat up.
Stitched up by the ship's surgeon and back in command.
But it didn't hurt, oddly enough, till
of
later.
French Commander Admiral Brueys aboard Lorient are far more serious. Horribly injured in the face and hands, he's then hit by a cannonball that removes his legs. He still refuses to leave his post on deck and dies there. As darkness falls, Guerrier and Spartiate, which have been under heavy fire for more than 2 hours, both strike their colours. Around the same time, HMS Leander breaks the French line between Peuple Souverain and Franklin, raking both. The battle is turning decisively in the Royal Navy's favour. Aquilon fights hard, turning herself to rake the British flagship HMS Vanguard. But in turn, she is raked by HMS Minotaur and hauls down her colours at 9:25. Peuple Souverain tries to escape by cutting her anchor cable and drifting down the French line. Lorient mistakes her for the enemy and opens fire.
Not good.
Minutes later, the flicker of flames is seen through the lower deck gun ports of Lorient.
Ooh, not good. Not good at all.
The fire spreads deck by deck until the massive French flagship is ablaze from stem to stern. Every onlooker knows that deep within Lorient's hold lies her grand magazine, containing 30 to 40 tons of gunpowder. All ships in the vicinity take emergency measures.
Right, get away from
Gun ports are
that.
closed, and ships' sides, decks and sails are soaked with water from the elm pumps in anticipation of the explosion to come.
Yep.
French ships Tonnant, Heureux and Mercure cut their anchor cables, hoping to drift to a safe distance. Around 10 p.m, the fire reaches Lorient's grand magazine. The warship is obliterated in a colossal explosion, killing everyone left on board and many who jumped overboard to save themselves. More than 90% of the ship's crew are killed. Around 1,000 men. The sheer force of the explosion spares nearby ships as flaming wreckage is blasted up and over them.
That's impressive.
Stunned, both sides stop firing to gaze in horror at the spectacle. British ships lower boats to rescue the few survivors. After a 10-minute lull, firing resumes. But after the appalling destruction of their flagship, the French are running out of fight. Swift-shore and defence turn their guns on Franklin and soon force her surrender. Tonon, having cut her cables and unable to maneuver, drifts helplessly into the French rearguard. These 3 ships, unable to sail into the wind to join the action, have looked on impotently as the carnage unfolds.
Victory is not a name strong enough for such a scene. Nelson surveying Aboukir Bay, 2nd of August, 1798.
Dawn on the 2nd of August revealed a terrible scene of death and destruction. John Nichol of the Goliath was a witness. I went on deck to view the state of the fleets, and an awful sight it was. The whole bay was covered with dead bodies, mangled, wounded and scorched. Not a bit of clothes on them, except their trousers. The entire French vanguard had been captured or destroyed, and Mercure have run aground in their panicked attempt to escape the explosion of Lorient. The 4 surviving French ships of the line will now attempt to fight their way clear. 2 run aground. Only the Généraux, Guillaume Tell, and 2 frigates escape the devastation. The captain of the Guillaume Tell, Pierre Villeneuve, will face sharp criticism for failing to play a greater part in the battle. 7 years later, as fleet commander, he will face Nelson again at Trafalgar.
Oh boy.
British losses are 218 killed, 678 wounded. 3 ships
French
are
are going to
badly
be a lot
damaged.
higher.
Bellerophon, Majestic, and Culloden. French losses are around 1,700 killed, and more than 3,000 taken prisoner, many of them wounded. 2 ships of the line and 2 frigates have been sunk. 9 have been captured. Of these, 3 are damaged beyond repair and burned. The remaining 6 enter service with the Royal Navy. To cap it all, most of the French treasury that General Bonaparte was relying on to fund his Egyptian campaign had been lost with Lorient.
Ugh, not good. Gotta be able to pay those soldiers. First gain the victory and then make the best use of it you can. Nelson.
Nelson's brilliant victory at the Nile had major consequences.
Oh yeah.
The balance of naval power in the Mediterranean shifted dramatically in Britain's favour. General Bonaparte's expeditionary force in Egypt was cut off, and though its commander slipped back to France the following year, his army was forced to surrender in 1801. The French garrison of Malta also surrendered, the island becoming a British protectorate. French defeat encouraged her enemies to form a new second coalition and renew the war.
Right.
Nelson was the hero of the hour, feted in royal courts from London to St. Petersburg and Constantinople. He received jewels, medals, ceremonial swords, and his long-coveted peerage, Baron Nelson of the Nile.
Okay.
The Nile was one of the most decisive and crushing naval battles in history. Some historians argue it was the most significant Nelson ever fought, but the battle with which Nelson's name was to be forever linked would be fought 7 years later.
Right.
Off Cape Trafalgar.
We'll get there.
Have you ever wanted to hear more from the ordinary soldiers and sailors of the Napoleonic Wars?
Yes.
What did combat look like from the front rank of the Grande Armée, or Wellington's army in Spain? What was it like to charge into the breach at Badajoz, or face Spanish partisans in the guerrilla war? In our next video, Epic History is bringing to life a score of dramatic eyewitness accounts from the Peninsular War, from French, British, Spanish, German and Polish veterans. And if you want to be first to see this new documentary, you can head over to Prestige streaming service Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service built by creators.
All right, so it looks like it's ad time. So yeah, that was interesting. That's one of the few major engagements of the Napoleonic Wars that I actually knew a little bit about, thanks to one of my fellow students who did a report on it. So hope I was able to add a little bit. And I wanted to add that stuff about sounding because we talk about it a lot when we're talking about naval combat of this era, but we don't always make sure everybody understands what it is, how it worked, and that can be interesting too. And like I said, right about this time is when we're going to see a transition from pure just drop a heavy weighted rope down to having actual mechanical devices within a couple of years of this. So, interesting times. And the French actually did use a lot of those newer mechanical models starting around, I want to say 1802, but I could be wrong. My grandfather was an avid sailor. Every time he had a chance, he'd take his sailboat out. And he used to take me a lot whenever I could be spared from school. We'd spend 2 or 3 days floating out on some lake somewhere. He also occasionally went to the ocean. I never went with him on any of those, unfortunately. But he actually liked to play around with things like old-fashioned sounding and things like that. So we actually played around with some of that. Kind of interesting stuff. I always kind of wish I had a sailboat of my own, but I don't think that's ever going to happen, unfortunately. I used to love it. It was fun. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye-bye.